Thanks very much, Deb, for that fabulous welcome to country. And as I always say, like, it is such a, I think, such a beautiful ritual, and it connects us deeply with our land and our landscape. And there is so much of learning that that we have yet to do from our from the Noongar people and indeed the Aboriginal people right across Western Australia. But guys, look, just thank you so much for coming. I know many of you have travelled really quite some way to be here. Special shout out to Deb Dowden. Where's Deb? Who's come all the way up there from the pastoral lands. We have really today pretty much, it's I guess it's a real focus probably on the agricultural region, but much of what we're doing has got implications for further north, and as Deb knows, we are doing some very special projects, particularly in our southern rangelands. But look, it's we even finally see our Prime Minister crab walking towards an acceptance of this, but climate change is, I think, without doubt, the biggest challenge facing our agricultural industry. And it's coming at us from two different directions. So on one hand, it's becoming hotter and drier, and that is making that task of farming more difficult. And coming around from the other angle are the increasing expectations of consumers, of retailers, of financiers that are going to impact on how our product is perceived and how we are able to fund, how our farming industry is going to be able to fund itself going forward. So agriculture, and particularly the livestock sector, is being hammered as the climate change problem child. We have David Attenborough is encouraging people to change their diet, to turn away from meat. He says the planet can't support billions of meat eaters, and we know meat-free Friday Mondays are becoming all the rage. Now, and plant protein is not off the hook either. Broadacre production of plant-based proteins require massive diesel-powered machinery. We've got nitrogenous fertilisers that are produced from fossil fuels. We have chemical inputs that are threatening biodiversity and processing that might undermine nutritional value. So that's the downside. But we think that there is an incredible opportunity to turn around what agriculture does and how it is seen in the climate change story. And in my view, and I have to say, I've learnt this from farmers. Everything that I know here, I have learnt from farmers, that transformation will come from embracing farming systems that see stronger soil biology, vegetative cover in our paddocks intensified, soil carbon growing significantly, and landscapes being rehydrated. It also comes from looking at alternatives to fossil fuels for power and production, and it comes to R&D about how we can reduce enteric emissions. So we're not here just talking about offsets. I don't think, and whilst there is a role for offsets, I don't think that that is really going to be the main game. It's not just about planting some trees so that you can continue to consume carbon, but I want to explore the opportunities that the actual act of growing things, the actual fundamental act of agriculture, is something that at very least is carbon neutral, if indeed not carbon positive. And we do know that we are going to need those things that are going to, carbon negative. We do need those things that are going to be able to act as a sink in order to be able to get to net zero. Now, I think climate change, of course, is primarily caused by an increase in greenhouse gas for human activity, and I do know there's perhaps a few people in the room that don't accept that, but I think that's pretty much the consensus around the world. But it is important to understand that clearing of land has in itself created part of the problem quite distinctly from the issue of the increased carbon level. And I think there's some, interesting research from University of Queensland and Department of Natural Resources and Water that have concluded that land clearing in the southwest of Western Australia has contributed to a 4 to 8% reduction in annual rainfall. So that's a reduction in rainfall that's not due to increased carbon levels in the atmosphere, but it is sequelae from the act of clearing. So it's just important. And I think that when we're looking at the current projections showing our winter rainfall will be decreasing from 1900 levels by up to 15% by 2030 and up to 20% by 2050, we've got to look at all the possible solutions. So I think that strengthening of the vegetative cover, I think the argument for getting more intensive vegetative cover to start dealing with that aspect of climate change that has come from land clearing is very important. So we go back to the emissions from agriculture, largely comprised of methane from livestock production, nitrous oxide from nitrogen in soils, and to a lesser extent, carbon dioxide from machinery burning fossil fuel and the use of lime and urea on soils. But of course, not all greenhouse gases are equal. The global warming potential of methane is 28 times that of carbon dioxide, and I find this incredible, but nitrous oxide 265 times that of carbon dioxide. So that means that 1 tonne of methane is the equivalent of 28 tonnes of carbon dioxide, and 1 tonne of nitrous oxide is equivalent to 265 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So our accounting is going to have to become increasingly sophisticated. So the release of 1 tonne of nitrous oxide would be eligible to create 300 carbon dioxide equivalent offset units. So if we can control nitrous oxide, for example, that gives a consequence that is much more significant in terms of return than cutting back on carbon dioxide. So in case of emissions resulting from the application of inorganic fertilisers, nitrous oxide emissions are calculated from the amount of nitrogen that it's applied in the fertiliser multiplied by emission factors. So, a big area for us to really be looking at in this scenario. So we've got the carbon footprint. There's a couple of different ways that this thing, I think that's not the next one, thank you. So we have the Australia's National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. That's that set out there, and that's showing that agriculture contributes 13% of Australia's emissions. And I think that figure, when we do that for on a WA basis, that gets up to 15%. But the reality is the figure is much higher when the entire agricultural system is taken into account. Now, when we actually look across the value chain, close to about a quarter of Australia's emissions come from agricultural type activities, and that's pretty much the same as we find around the world. So under the system that produces this, the emissions generated during the manufacture and the transport of agricultural inputs such as fertilisers, herbicides, pesticides and machinery are not counted as agricultural emissions. Emissions from fuel use used by agricultural vehicles either on farm or transporting product, and the fuel used to generate the electricity on the farm are also excluded. So that when you run your tractor or diesel on your farm, that's not actually counted in this inventory. But when your carbon footprint of your farm or produce is being assessed by your banker and by your customers, all of these things will be included. So it's important for us to get a picture. This is a sort of a national accounting that has a particular slant and excludes a whole range of things that really are part of your emissions profile. But this will be a very different story when you are going to be asked to account for the carbon footprint of your product. So we need to, our task is to actually look at that entire life cycle analysis of our produce, and we believe that we need, obviously, to do this, we're going to need some very sophisticated tools. And we'd really like some input about how we might be able to help develop some of those carbon calculators that will be effectively calibrated for West Australian conditions. And I'd really like some discussion around that today. So when we go to this life cycle analysis, every input that is required to get that product in the ground, get it grown, then get it to market, will become part of your carbon footprint. And there's some great work that's being done around the place, and including with our department, and we'll be having some presentations today from Richard Brake and Mandy Curnow, who have been talking about the work that they have been doing on DPIRD facilities to get a better handle on that. So we all know that even our Prime Minister is getting the fact that the world is changing, and our markets our customers will be increasingly asking questions about your carbon footprint. And this is whatever you're producing, wool, grain, beef, increasingly the market is saying we need to understand what your inputs and your emissions are, and this move is happening at a very fast pace. And of course, this is not something that is just affecting agriculture. Miners are getting it. People are being asked about the carbon footprint of their iron ore, and you can see that some of our producers are moving miners are moving very quickly to de-fossil fuel their mining operations because they can see the risk coming at them. Same with the manufacturing sector. So this is happening across the board. So it's no longer a marginal woke area. It actually is something that is going to the guts of international trade. And we've got to keep in our mind very clear that 80% of the produce in WA is exported. So this is really about, this is the real hardcore business of farming. We've got to work out how we account for this. What's going to be the mechanism? How can we help account for it? And then how can we improve our system? And I think this actually does present us with some incredible opportunities. I think that we've got, we've had 30 to 40 years, as Ralph was saying, where we have been experiencing a drying climate, and we've done some amazing things with our farming systems and our breeding to deal with that. But now we have to do, I think, something that is really quite different. But we've shown that we've got that capacity to adapt to change. Now, if I can just give you, really interesting, the European Union is in the process of establishing a carbon border adjustment mechanism in the context of the European Green Deal. So that would place a tax, effectively, a carbon price on imports of carbon-intensive goods from outside the EU. Because you can imagine the producers in the EU are saying, well, we're going to be required to be carbon efficient, and we can't have these products coming in from outside. Now, as Rolf said, this hasn't met with great enthusiasm from our Prime Minister, but this is going to be the way of the future. And we have to move with the times. We see, quite aside from what governments are doing, we've seen companies doing it. We're seeing PepsiCo, for example, have a target of 100% of their key ingredients to be sustainably sourced by 2030. And this will involve scaling up regenerative farming practices across 7 million acres, equivalent to the entire PepsiCo agricultural footprint. And PepsiCo say they want to source crops and ingredients in a way that accelerates regenerative agriculture and strengthens farming communities. We see Swiss multinational Nestlé as another example of a company that's embedding sustainability goals into its core operations. And like PepsiCo, they are committed to supporting farmers and suppliers advance regenerative agriculture over the next 10 years. And, this company, a massive purchaser of agricultural products, says tackling climate change can't wait, and neither can we. It's imperative to the long-term success of our business. We have a unique opportunity to address climate change as we operate in nearly every country in the world and have the size and the scale and the reach to make a difference. So I think, and it's really interesting with those two examples too, is that they are not just passively waiting for people to do better, that they're actually going out there and creating the opportunities to encourage a new agricultural practice. And of course, Asahi, now the increase that seems to own most of the non-craft beers in Australia, their beers now will be produced from barley purchased directly from Aussie farmers. And they will purchase barley in line with their sustainability requirements. So they're going to be, the grain will have to be segregated and tracked to maintain an intricate sustainability provenance. So this again shows the opportunity to get in to these premium markets. And look, I have to say I am very pleased to see the National Farmers Federation embracing the role of climate change at a national level with the release of their climate change policy last year. And there was talk at the federal government of wanting to exclude agriculture from within their carbon accounting system, and that was actually resisted by the Farmers Federation because they could actually see where the markets were heading in any event, and as an export nation we've got to be looking at that, but they could also see that in this there are some tremendous opportunities. There are tremendous opportunities for agriculture to actually benefit from being part of the solution to climate change. And we recognise that emission reduction and carbon sequestration have the opportunity to offer great benefit to agriculture. And we see Meat and Livestock Association taking a carbon neutral target by 2030, and we're working with MLA on a number of those projects. Now, and it's not just the markets that are changing, it's actually the financiers. We've got even APRA, now the body, the prudential authority that regulates all the banks and finance institutions. They're now they're putting out these statements. They want, although it's not a directive at this stage, that these are the sorts of things that CEOs of boards of banks and financiers need to look at. And now we see the investment sector really embracing this. So we've got a thing called the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative, and this includes 80 organisations, 4 of the big banks, the insurers, the super funds, that have released their roadmap that sets out their plan to align Australia's financial system to support these climate goals. And the roadmap calls for the financial system participants to embed sustainability into their organisation's purpose, strategy and leadership, and to support the transition of the transition of the economy to net zero emissions. So they're not talking about their own operations, they're talking about those things that they finance. So they now have a commitment that they, before they invest, they need to understand. They need to have gone through that process and understand what the carbon footprint of those people that they're investing in is. So now we've got two funds. We've got our business as usual and a few other special projects, but there's two major funds that we've got available to us immediately to help develop some of this climate response to climate change. So we've got the Climate Resilience Fund and the Land and Restoration Fund, each of $15 million. So we want to, we've got, the first is the Carbon and Land Restoration Fund. We've done some work around that particular fund, announced last November. But what we are going to be working with farmers for carbon sequestration projects that deliver environmental, social and economic benefits. And we're going to have part of that fund segmented to give a very special focus on soil carbon projects in low rainfall areas. Now that fund will be open by the end of the month. And I really think that this prospect of soil carbon is really the most transformative when it comes to us building climate resilience. And there is an international initiative called 4 by 1000 that was launched by France at the Paris Climate Conference. It's part of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. And what that has argued is that a 0.4% increase in soil carbon in the world's agricultural soils could absorb up to 35% of carbon emissions. I mean, which is an extraordinary prospect. Now, we were often told that can't work in much of WA because it's the rainfall is too low. We can't do that. I think that the science and the experience is suggesting otherwise, and in particular, I look forward to a number of presentations today, including from Raphael Rosell, who'll be talking us through some of the data and the opportunities. So if we can increase those carbon levels, increase that the moisture retention in our soil, it's going to be fantastic. Now, we've got Walter Jehne with us today. Walter, thank you very much for coming over. I had to travel late into the night to get over here for this event, so we really appreciate your work in soil microbiology and climate, and we look forward to hearing from you. So we then come to today's task, which is what are we going to do with the Carbon Resilience Fund. Now, some of this we will probably be putting into some matching funds in our drought hubs, but really we want to get your input as farmers and practitioners in the area as to how do we design tailored solutions for West Australian conditions. How can we get out there working with our growers to devise all different parts of the system. We're very open to which part of the system that we need to address, and we want everyone to be thinking broadly and give us the benefit of what are the key drivers that will deliver change, and what is the way in which we can put this money in to accelerate our move towards a net zero farming. So we are very, so we want you, we genuinely want you to be involved in the design of this fund. That's the whole purpose of today. And so we really look forward to your input. We want you to be out there, to be thinking. It's not going to be limited to today. I mean, obviously we're going to get some ideas from today, but we want to go forward and be working with all the different grower groups that are interested in doing this into how we develop these ideas. So it's not just a one-day opportunity, but it is going to be part of this partnership that we want with growers and grower groups. So guys, let's get together and work out how we can meet what I think is undeniably the great moral imperative that we have to address climate change for future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Right, and actually you don't want to believe all of that. I'm just simply a innocent bystander from down under. And really, as a soil microbial ecologist, that's where we're working all the time. And it's actually quite a wonderful world, because it's that world of soil microbiology that has actually created these biosystems, created the soils, the hydrology, the climate, the biosystems that we depend on fundamentally. But I'm very, very pleased to be here in WA this morning. As the Minister sort of said, I came in, we had a meeting with the Minister, the Forestry Minister, Federal Forestry Minister in Tasmania, but then we sort of said, hey, yeah, we can make it. And so we flew over last night, and we're here. And I just remembered, because the first time I came to WA was in 1970. And basically I was coming here from CSIRO, and we were working on Phytophthora cinnamomi, soil microbial ecologies. You had your jarrah forest, and of course there was that debate whether it's an exotic, a fungus from space or from somewhere else, or was it part of the natural soil microbial ecology that we had disturbed and unbalanced through our land management. And of course it's very, very important, these decisions, because it's all about empowering us. Because if we say it is us and our management, sure, we're responsible, but we, in doing so, also become response-able. Okay? We're no longer trapped by, hey, we're captured in something. And that's terribly important. So it's this understanding of the natural ecology of what we're working with, because basically that gives us empowerment, agency. And of course, Western Australia is a unique place globally, because basically it's one of the oldest landscapes on this planet, with some of the most leached, lowest nutrient soils. But for the last 46 million years, since it started surfing away from Gondwanaland, it's also developed a unique microbial ecology to adapt to these extreme circumstances. Okay, we've got very, very little nutrients, so how do we basically make it work? You haven't got a chance, so you might as well use it. Okay? And so that's in a sense what happens. And then we've had 46 million years of evolution. And then we develop the most bioproductive terrestrial ecosystems. When you look at the actual efficiency and the productivity of those systems relative to the input. Anyone can grow things on a heap of fertilizers or nutrients, but here are these natural systems growing, on nothing. And so they're the lessons for the future. You see, what are the processes? What's our understanding of those processes? How do we manage them? And then can we, through that, build a sustainable, resilient agriculture and future? Okay, and so that's really the power of Western Australia and that unique microbial ecology that you have got, and actually can really take you to world leadership positions. But let's come into, in a sense, what the Minister was talking about, because now, basically 2021, we're facing actually some pretty fundamental challenges. I mean, they've been in front of us all along. They were in front of us, our First Nations people, because basically 7,000 years ago or so, we lost the Australian monsoon. Australia used to have a monsoon. Basically, the inland of Australia was a beautiful savanna woodland. We've got all the pollen analysis, all the science, we can go into all the details of the science, it's all verified. But it was all basically casuarina, calitris, Mitchell grass, beautiful rangelands. But we lost the monsoon about 7,000 years ago, but also about 50 years ago, you in Western Australia started seeing Bureau of Meteorology data, the loss of rainfall. You've had about a 30% decline in rainfall. And so these are lessons that our ecology is giving us, and it's lessons that we have to understand what's causing it, what's our influence, but in having that knowledge, how do we actually manage that landscape better? And again, it's pretty hard on you because you've lost 30% of your rainfall, in the last 50 years there, but also it puts you ahead of the game globally, because that's actually the game now globally. Yes, we talk about climate change, we talk about CO2 going up, that's all real. But basically in 2005, leading scientists got together at the Hadley Centre. In fact, what the real issue with climate change now is dangerous hydrological extremes, accelerating dangerous hydrological extremes. They're impacting now, they're intensifying now. These are our hurricanes, our storms, our floods, our droughts, our aridification, wildfires. And these are the things that collapse biosystems, and these are the things that kill people. And they're the things that actually in the next 20 years are really going to impact and intensify. It's already happening, like forests are burning, but they're not coming back to where they were. Basically soils are degrading and they're progressively going down, down, down. Jared Diamond, right? We've lost 23 civilizations on this planet. They mostly last 300-400 years. When they degrade their soils, cactus. President Roosevelt, a nation that destroys its soil, destroys itself. Okay, so we know all this, but now the question is, where is it that we stand, and what is it we need to learn, and do we use that unique microbial ecology and understanding of our soils and our landscapes to say, right, we can do better. Can we regenerate? Can we reinforce the resilience of our biosystems to do that? Okay? And the good news is, powerfully the good news is, yes, we can. We can do all of this. Nature did it. She did it wonderfully. She started with bare rock and oceans 420 million years ago. She used fungi to solubilize some of that rock, leave some behind, some organic detritus, build water holding capacity, and then in 100 million years, but that's no time for her. But basically in no time, through the Carboniferous, put productive forests and soils and hydrology right across the 14 billion hectares of land on this planet. Pedogenesis, landscape regeneration. And she's done that repeatedly after every meteorite or volcano or whatever, exactly just switches that process back on again. Soil building, hydrology, and then cooling and biodiversity resilience. And again, you in Western Australia have the powerful tools through your soil microecology to do that. So what I wanted to talk about today, because we only have got, and you'll tell me when time's up, very limited time, but basically I just wanted to say, look, there's 10 massive opportunities that this understanding of your natural microbial ecology gives you to make Western Australia not just resilient, but make Western Australia a global leader in this ecological regeneration restoration story. And as we'll go in the end, give you a premium position in terms of nutritional integrity of the food and the produce that you produce. Okay? And so these are 10 avenues of, opportunities. And the first, of course, starts with water. Okay? Water is life. Basically, without water, you haven't got life. And again, you're the driest or one of the driest inhabited environments, but think of the other side. You've got the world's most intense evaporation basin to your west. It's called the Indian Ocean. 180 watts per square metre of energy, just evaporating water. And there's rivers of water flowing across all of Western Australia, up to 5%, 50,000 parts per million water in the air, flowing across all your arid areas. And of course the question is, how do we harvest it? And of course that's what, in a sense, 7,000 years ago, the First Nations people said, hang on a minute, we're losing the water harvesting capacity, we're losing the Australian monsoon. It's not precipitating, it's not condensing. Why? We can go into the discussion there, it's before I was around, but the point is that, here is again, natural factors, how do we manage that water? Because we can manage that water. Nature manages that water. Salt bushes harvest that water. Cacti harvest that water. So how do we design landscapes that look at, okay, here's these rivers of water in our air flowing across all our deserts continually. Where do we actually start looking at harvesting that water? Okay, so there's a whole area. Now, each of these areas we can spend 2 hours brainstorming all the science and technology, but we haven't got time now. The next one, of course, is where we do have rain, the critical thing is not how much we get. We get what nature gives us, if you like. But it's what happens to every one of those raindrops that we do get. Does it infiltrate, get retained, made available for plant growth, and give us the capacity to wisely extend the longevity of green growth because of that water, critical performance measure, longevity of green growth, or do we let it run off and evaporate and just run back into the ocean? And of course that is totally in our control, because how we manage the Earth's soil carbon sponge governs whether that flows into the soil or lost. If we take the data from the Murray-Darling Basin at the moment, and this is stuff we did with, I should have said, with Michael Jeffrey, because I was working for 15 years with Michael very much directly, and this is when we put 15 billion of your taxes on the table for a water plan for the Murray-Darling Basin, and the answer is, look, it's all about managing every one of those 100 raindrops. 99 fall on soils, obviously, 12 end up in streams, 2 are able to be captured in our dams, and then overflow the dams, of course, out to sea. 86 are actually in the landscape, but even though 86 in the landscape, over 50 evaporate, about 36% or 36 drops out of 100 are used for transpiration. So we've got 50 times more water that we're wasting through evaporation than we have in our dams. And Barnaby, he can't build enough dams to cover 50 drops out of 100. There's only 2. And all our industrial water use, urban use, and irrigation use has to come from those 2 out of 100. Okay, so we're really, in a sense, compromising ourselves. So the whole idea of looking at the soil carbon sponge, sure, you can do all the carbon accounting, but yeah, that's just numbers. The dividend, the real significance of it, is putting that carbon into your soil to rebuild the sponge, to rebuild the hydrology. And again, we won't go into today because it's that hydrology that nature used to naturally, safely cool the planet within weeks. It can do it within weeks. Not the centuries it'll take for the CO2 emission reductions to have any effect on temperatures. Okay, so basically it's the actual availability of that water. And again, that word availability, it's not quantity, it's availability that's critical. Okay, and this then goes further basically if we look at evaporation. If there's 50 drops out of 100 that are evaporating, how do we actually reduce that evaporation? And we've already talked about it. We've got to maintain protective green plant covers to stop the winds. It's a wind speed, wind scour on the soil surface that evaporates. A molecule has to escape into that wind. If we have that protective insulation layer, it can't do so. So protecting longevity of green growth, protective thing, but also trees. Okay, if we can come back into integrating agroforestry into our landscape, massively drops the surface wind speeds, wind scouring, massively increases the water retention in that habitat and lowers evaporation. At night time, those trees are absolutely condensation surfaces, harvesting water from those rivers of aerial water that flow across us. Casuarina, cristata, desert oak, 2 millimeters per night, right? Harvesting water through their leaf condensation. Okay, and so over dry seasons, that's 8 inches of rainfall. We've got people who are growing beautiful crops on 8 inches of rainfall. Okay, so the potential of harvesting that water, getting some of those 50 out of 100 drops through that land management. So these are the natural sort of agencies that we've got. We can also, of course, restore the productivity of soils. We see a lot of problems about, okay, we've got salinity, we've got acidification, we've got aluminium toxicity, and straight away we say, come on, let's bring in the Mack trucks with lime to sort of try and neutralize this acidity. Well, nature didn't have Mack trucks and it didn't use lime. They just increased the organic matter content of the soil. Organic matter has a massive 30,000 to 1 negative charges across its surfaces. These negative charges, of course, what do? They absorb positive charges. So all the hydrogen ions that are causing your acidity get absorbed onto these organic matter surfaces, and your pH goes back up to neutrality. That's how nature did it. So, hey, if we're building a sponge, we've got this organic matter, we can do it as well. Another key area that we've got to get into is actually biofertility. Again, nature didn't have fertilizers. It didn't need fertilizers because nature sort of said, look, over 80% of the biofertility of a soil is governed by the availability of those nutrients. It's not how many nutrients there are, it's their availability. And the fixation, solubilization, access, uptake, and cycling of nutrients governs that availability. And each of those processes is governed by microbes, your soil microbial ecology. So if you can rebuild a healthy soil, you rebuild basically this whole nutrient available story. You see, and so you're getting dividends on dividends on dividends from this regenerative, thing. So, yeah, you don't need fertilizer. I worked in CSIRO, tropical soils, Kulula, Fraser Island, rainforests on sand dunes, the world's most bioproductive terrestrial ecosystems, effectively on crushed glass. Bugger all nutrients of anything, right? But every nutrient was cycled so rapidly that it was able to sustain that productive system. Hey, and we can take that into agriculture. And we can grow productive crops and biomass, etc., continually. And we can do that with limited nutrients. But, yes, we have to be wise. We have to bring those nutrients from our effluents and other things back into the system to, again, rebuild the cycle, to get out of extractive mining into sustainable ecology. Yes, we can do it. The next step, then, is really quite exciting. And this comes to the discussion that the Minister had raised, and this really is the issue of the nutritional integrity of our food. Okay? Now, it's, again, it'll take a whiteboard and really detailed science, but it's all verified. Plants in nature take up nutrients in a completely different way than our industrial agricultural crops. Pretty radical, isn't it? Okay, in nature, 98% of plants are mycorrhizal. They have associations with fungi in the soil, and these fungi provide extensive networks of fungal hyphae that proliferate throughout the soil. I've measured them, it's tedious, 25,000 kilometers per cubic meter of healthy soil. So the membrane interface between that toxic mineral soil and the living plant is immense. You just think of it, membrane interface. But that membrane interface isn't just passive. It is selectively, intelligently actively taking up the nutrients that the fungus and therefore the plant needs and leaving behind and excluding toxic nutrients or excessive nutrients. So it's an intelligent quality control interface between the dead mineral world and life. And basically up to the Second World War, most of our food, 98% of our, not whatever percentage, was basically grown in this organic way, right? Through these natural microbial uptake processes. And that ensured that our food had the 50 essential nutrients and trace elements that we needed for our preventative health. Linus Pauling, back in the 50s, 4 Nobel Prizes, 90% of our preventative health governs by the nutritional integrity of what we put in our face, our food. Okay? And of course, our food now has completely compromised because when we go into high input industrial agriculture, we kill all that fungal interface and we're reliant basically just on the the water absorption by those roots in their transpiration stream, taking up nutrients that might be in the soil solution. Most of the nutrients are held, as you know, on cation exchange surfaces, not in the soil solutions because otherwise they'd be lost, dumb. And basically now our industrial food is getting, yes, the soluble nutrients we put on, the nitrates, sulfates, etc., but also some of the nasties that are in the soil solution, aluminium in low pH soils, sodium, etc., right? So we've got a completely different nutritional composition in our food as we did. It's got less than a third of the nutrient concentration and often zero of the essential trace elements. Things like selenium, right? I mean, we only need parts per billion. But basic selenium is critical for an enzyme, a perioxidase, and if we don't have selenium, we don't have perioxidases, and if we don't have perioxidases, we can't kill cancer cells. Simple biochemistry. Okay? And see, that's what's been happening. We are now basically, in the last 50 years, driving an exponential, diet-driven explosion of self-induced diseases. You know, your diabetes, your cancers, your attention deficit, your autoimmune cardiac diseases. These are all diet-related, self-induced diseases. Probably, I hate to say it, 60% of us are subclinically malnourished in nutrients. And of course, we now got a $10 trillion a year industrial food system. You farmers get about 6 cents in the dollar from that, but don't worry about that. Well, you do worry about it, but you do have to worry about it. But that $10 trillion a year global industrial food system drives a $20 trillion plus global industrial disease industry. And that's what, in a sense, the future's got to break, right? Because basically it's the nutritional integrity of our food that governs our preventative health. And basically in the post-pandemic, post-COVID reality, how do we actually get back to health? Because at the end of the day, as we're saying in the car coming down, it's actually consumers voting with their dollars, not for politicians, but for preventative health. Their kids, their family, their grandkids, right? And again, you in Western Australia, in the way you can grow food, you in Western Australia with the natural microbial ecology that you've got at your disposal, you're in a world prime position to actually put this high quality food at premiums onto the global market, not chasing commodities at 6 cents in the dollar. Okay, so look, these are just some of the sort of key areas. I mean, I could keep on going because I think with time's getting grazing ecology, forest fire management. But what it's really saying is, look, nature has given you this absolutely unique and powerful tool and understanding to regenerate and restore these landscapes, but to build resilience, because it's these dangerous hydrological extremes that are impacting, and it's really that capacity to now take these lessons, make that happen. So the challenge is, how do we catalyze that change? How do we get that basically demonstrated? The science is there, the evidence is there, there's really innovative leaders amongst you who are outstanding in doing this. And so how do we see that as these are the catalysts, these are the sort of lifeboats to the future? So thank you very much.
Yeah, that was fantastic. It just, shows, because I think it is really important to understand the deep picture. And I guess your story is we've got, these magnificent jarrah forests, etc., on the soil which appears to be of little nutritional value. How does that happen? So you've really explained that. So it's given us great hope. So we're now just going to have a bit of a Q&A for Walter and myself. But Walter, can I just start off by asking this question? So how would, and often growers say this to us, well, how would I start? If I want to do this, if I want to exploit this value, what's the fundamental thing I have to start doing to create this change?
Look, absolutely. And of course, there's a few percentages amongst us who do it out of passion, and they'll just do it because that's their passion. They're like the people who are way out there. But often, no, as an individual grower, it's very, very difficult because it may be a 5-10 year transition period. You've got to feed the kids in the meantime, and it's very difficult. But also, it's extremely difficult because the status quo is loaded against you. All the taxes, regulations, subsidies, protection rackets, etc., are sort of structured against it because they've been lobbying very successfully and over decades, with great respect. I mean, obviously great respect, but the point is that the thing, like in the US, we've got a $980 billion a year farm bill. 96% of it goes to the top end of town, protecting the fertilizer, pesticide industry. So where does and then an organic farmer says, okay, hang on, I can't produce this stuff. I have to sell it at 4 times the commercial price. Yes, of course, because there's a protection racket. It's as simple as that, right? And so it's very difficult. We also, though, need innovative government. This is really critical because say, look, we must transition. We must get onto this new paradigm. So look, let us take, for example, this degraded land and let us demonstrate in the space of 10 years how we can not just regenerate the natural capital, but here are the business cases that makes this a 400% return on investment. Okay? So I think it's having that capacity to go beyond. So from an individual, it's very, very hard. This is the work that Charles Massian, we were doing at ANU and stuff like that. All that's left in Australia is about 100,000 farmers, right? And about 3,000 of them have really gone passionately on a limb to say, I'm into regenerative farmers on my own terms. But about 15,000 of them have spent their money doing courses, holistic management, other sort of courses, to really be aware, prepared, and knowledgeable. And they're, in a sense, the second adopters, wisely sitting on the fence at the moment it doesn't pay. I was involved with Julia Gillard, sort of basically, 12 years ago now, trying to get a carbon price recognised. We won through RUD, we won $23 million for a SCARP program, a carbon accounting, which was supposed to, Cabinet agreed, will work with innovative farmers to define mechanisms for counting and enhancing carbon. And that just got that just got sidetracked by other people. But the point is that, you see, so it's very, very hard. There's barriers, but don't give up. 15% of basic there. And once the market signal comes, and once especially the consumers start saying, hey, this nutritional integrity story matters, and it does, they're just not aware of it, they haven't a vehicle to express their desires or their imperatives, then the tipping point comes very quickly.
No, I understand that, but what we're trying to get is to that tipping point. We know that there are farmers here, and a number of them will be on a panel later on, but I guess, so what we understand, there's a role here for government in providing assistance in this way. But I think probably the growers that we might have around this room, they don't necessarily want to wait for 10 years for the system to. So what's the thing? How do you kickstart?
Well,
how do you get?
Okay. Well, what we do, like in Tasmania, where I came, no, you just form a group of innovators at a regional level in a specific sector, and say, right, how do we get critical mass amongst ourselves, and how do we now build a market relationship? For example, here is a brewer, and we're going to grow barley, and that brewer wants premium barley without all the insecticides and stuff like that. And this group of growers now has got the critical mass to go to that grower. Yes, we can give you 3 million tonnes a year, and that's in a sense, a clustered network regional breakout. And basically, if local government can support that, that's fantastic.
And that's why we're very keen to get grower groups here. Sir, over to you. And just let everyone know who you are. Thank you. Could you get back to Mark, Scott?
Philip Logue from Perenjori. I'm a budding regenerative agriculture practitioner. There's about 30 within 100 kilometres of me are looking at this. I think Alannah's question is really important. Where do you start from? Because the markets are the second proposal, so we'll be using the cooperatives, we'll be doing that. But there's an information overload. Where do you get the information on what products to use? Because nearly, 3/4 of us are using totally different avenues and products and companies that supply it. So we still need multinationals and people to supply us with the products. We're still product buyers, even though we're not buying from the multinational toxin companies. So the question that I'd like to reiterate what Alannah's asked is, how do we get the right information from the right experts so that we don't have to spend our first 10 years making experiments? That's the frustrating bit that my peers are going through now.
And be careful, because a lot of the experts are salespeople for actually more products. And so the first thing you just talk about it, and the biggest initial income you can make is savings, right? What don't I have to buy? What can I actually rationalise? Can I actually work with 20% of that input managed more efficiently? And that's the bottom initial balance sheet question. Or can I actually recycle that resource from somewhere else, right? Can I use basically effluent? Can I manage effluent and use that as a biofertilizer rather than I'm buying in, nitrogenous fertilizer or something? So just think through it, but I agree, it's helpful to have a catalyst, just stimulating, asking questions, listening to your needs, and then saying, hang on, we could put A and B and C together, and then we've got an option. And that's the sort of thing that we as NGOs do, but I agree that most of the paid advisors end up being salespeople pushing product, or otherwise, with respect, again, they get in a administrative system where there are constraints where they have to operate within what the policy guidelines are.
Can I just make a suggestion and tell me if this, because thinking from the interaction that we've had with farmers on this stuff, an idea that I had is if we had a group of growers, like whether it's a formal grower group or a geographic group like you, that wanted to do this, thinking of, say, if we bought someone out, like a Walter or a Nicole Masters or someone here that could, do, say, maybe a 2-day masterclass, like going through it with an eye on your particular, rainfall and whatever you've got there. And then those that wanted to take this further, we could, provide a voucher system. We do this in other areas where that person could come out and spend a day or 2 days or whatever on your farm going through chapter and verse, like how you would go about it. So sort of getting these ideas, then sort of getting a bit of a group session going, and those that were prepared, we'd meet the cost 50% for those that wanted to go the next step and have someone come out onto their farm and talk about like the practical steps. Would that be something that would be useful, do you think?
Definitely. We need an education gap between, rather than having to go to holistic classes.
Yeah. And it's tailored to your needs. And often that's another leading farmer. They may not be in your district, but just say, here's somebody, here's Cole, who's done pasture cropping. You're looking at pasture cropping. And just as the minister said, look, you want Cole there for a weekend, right? We can actually, you're looking at pasture cropping potentials. He's a world expert. Get him there for a weekend and make him sing and dance on your behalf.
It's fantastic. Gentleman there.
That's John Hicks, retired farmer from Pingrove. The whole time I was farming, I was a conventional farmer, a moron farmer if you like, a sucker for the salesman. John, I can fix this problem, just use this can or bag or bucket and slap some more on. And as a result, there's less left.
So is that why you say a moron farmer?
Yeah, M-O-R-E-O-N, right? M-O-R-E-O-N. We've got to be very careful because otherwise, this is 2021 and there's all sorts of harassment problems,
And that, you might agree with the other meaning of the word also. But look, I'm a young bloke of 28. I've just taken over the old man's farm and we've been full on chemical farming. If we want a better crop, we slap on more urea. We've got a potash deficiency. Well, we whack on some potash. We've got a weed in the crop. Go and get another herbicide. We've got a fungus. Go and get a fungicide. And we're just making a load for our own back. The first thing we've got to do is change the mindset from yield. I stick my chest out in the pub and say I've had a 3-tonne average. Yeah, but what profit have you had? $10 a hectare. The regenerative farmer says, I've had a 1.5-tonne average and I've got $100 to the hectare profit. That's the first mindset, but no one tells you how much money they're making. So I want to find out how to become a regenerative farmer, and my suggestion is identify the regenerative farmers, and I thank those who have been brave enough to put their heads up and say I'm regenerative and share their knowledge with the rest of us. But there are a lot of farmers that are keeping their heads down. Identify them, get those in a specific area together and say, right, I want to go regenerative. What do I do what time of the year do I start? Yep. What do I do on day one? What do I do in the run up to seeding? What do I do after the crop's growing? What do I do at harvest time? Then what do I do in year 2, etc.
Yep.
And just a blueprint to follow.
Yep.
And what brews do I use? What do I don't do? And that is just as important because, and biology, I can't see it. It does whatever, I know it exists and it does its thing, whatever that is, but I wouldn't have a clue. Well, we've got to get informed on biology. But, and because it's a living thing, you only have to kill it once.
That's right. John, look, I think I totally agree with you. I think that there is this, and we see this, there are people, as Walter identified, and many of the people in this room are those passionate people that have embraced it. But there is still a lot of people that are sitting on the fence and they're a bit scared of putting their head up, because if you say regenerative, and you're maybe at the Jehne pub on a Friday night, you might get your head blown off, but that people do want, we need to get into that real practical stuff, and that's what I was talking about with the man over there, that I think that there's a place for us, and that's what we want. That's like, I think what we were hoping that would come out of this, that you'd get clusters of farmers from areas that say, we want someone to come out. We're not saying necessarily we'll do it. Come out, give us a masterclass, and then if you're really interested, we'll go halvies with you on getting someone out working with you on your farm to tell you this is the blueprint for your farm. Sir.
Thanks, Murray Gray, Chair of the West Midlands Group. I'm interested to know whether or not you've seen around the world where nutrient density of food is actually being measured and marketed broadly, because we sort of, the talk here, the likes of Nestle sort of saying they want sustainable ingredients produced, and yet 100% of their food portfolio is actually unhealthy, and seen to be unhealthy. So are there areas where that nutrient density is being measured and then marketed accordingly, that we could perhaps, aspire to?
Yeah, look, it is, but it doesn't come then marketed in that way, because it doesn't go into the consumer, the Woolies, the Coles, the thing. But no, look, exclusive restaurants all over the world are saying, look, I'm selling these meals at a premium, therefore I want to sell them on these quality values, and they will source according to these nutrient, how the food is grown. And definitely, so there's enormous market in that way, but it's not, here's a documentation, that you're looking for at supermarket level, right? Because no, that food probably will get marketed directly. And what will happen is, farmers markets, it's that simple. You take control, because basically people want to know, where is this food grown? How is this food grown? Have I got confidence in how it is grown, that it has that nutrition? We don't need to measure the amount of potassium in every carrot at parts per billion. We just have to know that that carrot was grown in this way, and I can be confident that these systems then have got, it has that nutritional integrity because of those fungal systems that it was used to grow it.
But can I just pick up on this, because I think this is a critical issue, and people like John Kempf are acknowledging that there is a bit, like we sort of, I guess we know it, but can we produce the documentary evidence? So because I think that's fundamental for us to do this, and so what I want us to be moving on a number of different fronts. So the idea I've had in relation to that, and I've approached Murdoch University, their Phenome Centre, right? So they have got some of the most advanced equipment in the world with this nuclear magnetic resonance machine, right? And hopefully, I don't know, Ralph, where we've got to with this one, whoever's working on this one, but I've asked them to put together a project for us so we can take it in a West Australian context, right? And we will take some conventionally farmed product, and we will, we'll do wheat, we'll do avocados, we'll do, the stuff that we're doing a lot, and do that analysis so that we've actually got, some hard evidence. So, because I think we've got to be moving on, I don't think there's just one particular front, we've got to be moving on a whole heap of fronts, and there's a lot of people that contest this idea. Now, I am positive you are correct, but I want to get a bit of science around it. We can say, here, this is what we've got. In the West Australian context, we can show you that difference.
Yeah. We've already got that on a broad scale. Yeah. Hectolitre weights and screenings and everything. Yeah. We go to a bulk commodity system. Yeah. So it's there. It hasn't been educated back to the grower why it's there. Yeah. So if your nutrient density goes out in the food, your hectolitre weight goes down and your screenings go up. And you can see that in the performance of your animals if you're running livestock, etc. And you can see it in the ecosystem. We're at a critical point now that we need to service people, like everyone in the room, that wants to move forward with this, but we need consistency of supply of fertilisers and microbial inoculants and that are measured and consistent and don't vary, because in an organic regenerative system, up until this point in time in WA, the results are very inconsistent, from very poor to very good, and that's coming from stuff we make ourselves or we buy in, or etc. So we need the knowledge to understand to get that consistency.
And how would we go about that?
People like Walter, I've been listening to Walter for years and years, and it's that microbial, and everyone that's successful in an organic or regenerative space, and that information is now bubbling to the surface, it's got to be a fungal dominant thing. So.
Yeah, but look, may I just add, and I'm a scientist, so I don't disagree at all, we can measure things, but see, science can become a part of the impediment as well, where, hang on, not proven, therefore we can't do it. But it's very, very simple. You just sort of put the different carrots in a blender and try and feed bacteria on it, and if the bacteria die in the industrial carrot, the bacteria don't even like it. They'll die. Yeah. You see, and there's a bioassay, and hey, what's the difference? We're no different from those bacteria. We need proper tucker. Here's a bioassay, 48 hours, costs nothing. The data's there. So the evidence is there, that practical evidence is there, but often it's not always dressed up to go to the ball at a scientific conference.
Well, that's right, but it's also because, you know, we're wanting to make sure that markets are properly informed, right? Mm-hmm. And you can't not everyone is in the same space that we're at here with that knowledge, right? So we have to be prepared to do some things that put us in a better place to be able to sell that story. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying it's unproven. Like, I have no doubt that this is true. I mean, you just have to look at cancer rates, like how bizarre it is that the increase in cancer rates when we've got supposedly a much better fed population, something is happening. So, and I think people are interested, but I do think if we can back that up with something that people would feel confident about accepting rather than just getting bacteria eating your carrot juice.
No, I agree. I mean, I'm with you. I'm just saying there's another step, and horses for courses,
Stuart McAlpine, Farmer Bunteen. Probably the last few minutes have sort of gone along the lines that I would have had some, made some comments around sort of using technology to justify our means. But I think what you can do to help is, I'm just so tired. I'm really, really worn out from being alone for 15 years and not having any support. And the best thing you can do is actually support the innovators of change. We need support from the department to mentor and actually move and help us with our systems. They're working really well, but we don't have the confidence because we're breaking new ground, we're doing our own trial work, and we're just getting worn out.
Yeah, look, Stuart, I really appreciate that. And I have to say it's been on a journey with the department too. You guys captured me very early on in the piece, kidnapped me and got me thinking along this path. And it's been a big journey from the department, but we've now, Ralph and Carl and Corinne are now very much leading a team. They realise this is not just, doing enough to keep the minister happy sort of thing and, having, some faux stuff done, that I think, people are actually now saying this is a real serious thing. And so that's what we want to do, and that's what we want to go out and offer that very practical support. We are trying to develop. We've got to do things like GRDC at the moment. Can you imagine getting GRDC to sort of like be co-investing in this stuff? So we've come up with some ideas of what are some angles that you might get them where they're prepared to do, because a lot of our money goes into co-investment with them. We've got to try to bring their hearts and minds as well. And Stuart, we did, we helped set up that regen network. We want to continue to do that work and to help and assist. And, there's new people coming on board every time. We meet our friends out in Coolin, the Savages, and we've got Dean Ryan here. There's the group of people that are really coming on board and is increasing.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Minister Walter, David McFall from Curnow. In the 70s when I was going through Ag College, we were actually considered alternative because we introduced really fringy stuff like farming goats and things like that, and even horticulture in the Narrogin Ag College. And then we went on to being, I guess, a conservative farmer through the 80s onto a sustainable, holistic moving through the spectrum from regenerative, organic, we're probably now into the agroecological space, and even gone on to the indigenised ag space where we're looking at systems thinking to bring a balance back in our landscape, diversity and things like that. So to cut to the chase, I think there's been from my observation through that 4 decades of applying these systems, there's been a lack of vision and leadership at many, many levels. We haven't got a problem of knowledge, we've got a distribution problem of knowledge. We've got a distribution problem of food. You know, we can feed the world, but we've got a distribution problem. It's the same sort of nexus we're facing. And we seem to kind of not discuss the elephant in the room issues, and that's the land's overcleared, it's overworked, it's overgrazed, and it's underloved. And Minister, I think the state government, through not just the current colour but the previous colours throughout the whole spectrum, have really dropped the ball here, because when you have a title that's, you know, Minister for Agriculture, Food and Hydrogen Economy, I kind of wonder why bioeconomy is not part of that title, because that really seems to be the missing link, to bring back the trees, bring back the vegetation cover, and drive it through incentivised programs like desal, bioenergy desal and things like that. They're all attainable, low-hanging fruit, but yet as a farmer, we don't have those tools put in our hands to change our broadacre system, which is, you know, making a lot of money, but there's no restitution cost in that program. I see many abuses of landscape, but there's no restitution. So the farmers will keep on making that money unless we kit them up with different tools. And I think the bioeconomy, I'm not talking offsets, I'm talking short rotation, harvested crops, whatever they may be, to go into desalination, to go into biofuels. Pepsi Cola's talking later on, we talk about bioplastics. So why don't we drive the innovation and the change capacity through those mechanisms? Thank you.
May I just contribute to that? And it's not necessarily for the government, but basically, okay, 100,000 farmers, $100 billion in debt. Okay, so the banks have got a vested interest. Okay, and so if you have new metrics, if you say here are metrics for natural capital, here's metrics for resilience, yes, I'm getting a crop 4 years out of 5 still, not 2 years out of 5 under this extreme habitat, and then you basically go on the banks and those banks, insurance institutions, and say, right, this is really where value is, and then those bioeconomy values really stand out. Okay, and I think we all agree, yes, this is the bioeconomy is really the key to the future, but it's actually those people who are putting money in, banks, insurance, when they recognise, hey, we've got to have a portfolio that's covered on those criteria, not the current short-term yields.
All right, okay, now we've got a few more minutes. Yeah, sorry, I'm going to ask this. We have got a lady asking a question there, sorry.
Hey.
Yeah. Normally I say one male, one female. I forgot why I didn't say that today.
That's right.
Georgie Troop, so a farmer and also research scientist with DPIRD, but I'm here as a grower today. Thank you, Walter, for focusing on enduring profitability for the grower. Without us being profitable, there is no agricultural broadacre cropping industry in Western Australia. So we can go down the path of supporting the 3%, which is one arm, or we can go down the path of supporting the 97% and providing that cost-benefit analysis and the ranking of priorities of actions to get us to the path that you see as a future for us. And so for me, I think that's where I'm sitting, is that 97%. We have 6 distinct ag zones, Minister. We have ag industry where we know we need to see something nearby, we need to see something in our own environment to be able to reflect on our own farm business and how that translates to change in our farm business. So there's opportunities, so many opportunities for us to be able to see examples of how they fit into our farm business to be able to make us make changes.
And Judge, that's exactly what, and that's why we're having this meeting with growers, and I pick up John's point of view. We want profitability, and we understand that is critical. we've got to stop the God bean yield, and we've got to start getting the God bean profitability. And we want to do that. We want to go out and get clusters of farming, whether it's the West Midlands group or the Gillamai group, you know, coming together and saying, okay, we're interested. And as I said, we will get, and the part thing I am conscious of is that we do have people like Stuart and Di Haggerty that have been doing lots of this work, and that, and, you know, we can't have them just constantly being those. We've got to develop that group. And we've got to, and that's why we want to get groups of farmers coming together in and sharing this and sharing it, and we'll provide the support to get through that practical thing. So we see the numbers, you know, so we've been on this journey for 4 years. We've seen the numbers increasing, but we want to accelerate it. And we think the interest is there, but we need you guys to come together and say, yeah, we want to give it a shot. We want to at least have a look at it, and we'll be there to support you. Sorry, there's a lady behind you. So,
thank you very much. Thank you, Minister, and thank you. I didn't catch your name, but thank you for what you said. I'm just going to reflect a little on what I've seen here today. So I'm Nicola Parker. I'm Deputy Vice Chair of Western Beef Association with James here, and also a peer colleague, Jehne, a colleague from Western Beef Association. For me, one of the key things I wanted to get out of today was to understand what success looked like to you, Alannah, in the spending of that fund. And today I've heard lots of people ask for support in different areas. And actually, on 3 separate occasions, you have talked about a vision of support, and no one here has actually actively picked up on it. You are talking about giving farmers an opportunity to have consultants and specialists come to their property, their region, their area, and tell them what those changes can look like for them and how to go about it. On 3 separate occasions, you've made reference to that. So, Minister, what are the next steps for us to make that a reality and to actually bring that back to our farm and make it work for us? What are the next steps of giving you those group of farmers so that consultants can come out and have 2 days in their spot and make it real for them and help them build a strategy of change to work more towards regenerative farming practices that support everything we're here today to learn more about?
Excellent. Thank you. I really like that, very drilled down. Get right to the pointy end. That's so today, towards the end of the day, there'll be sessions where farmers will be putting out their ideas. We'll be relying on the feedback like you've given. So just before we made any of those final decisions, we wanted to have this feedback session. We wanted to get your ideas so that we didn't race off and spend it all on something that people actually weren't interested in, right? So we're sort of like ground truthing. Part of this is about ground truthing what the ideas would be. But if there is strong support for that, we will, after today, at the end of the day, if that comes through, I'm detecting it will from the feedback, then we will put together that program. Now, we're desperate. I want to get this stuff rolled out quickly. We don't want to hang about. We want to get this stuff moving. So we've already had some discussions about how we might do it, who we might do it with, but we can get, I would hope by the end of the month, a decision on how a scheme like that would work, and we will put that out for interested grower groups or groups of, people like your group saying, yep, we'll be one of the sponsors to do this, and so it can happen. But we need that feedback from you. I think, from what I'm hearing today, that people do want that sort of very practical, how does this thing... Now, we have to do other things as well. We have to do, some of the bigger picture stuff, but to get the ball rolling, we've got to get out there with the growers.
And I think we need to be sharing those stories. We need to be sharing those steps and approach. We need to make sure that, yes, we're talking about distribution of knowledge and experience, and we need to be telling people what we're doing as we go. Not this is how we spent your 15 million at the end of the term. This is what we're doing on the way. These are the steps that we're making. This is the change that we need to support, and we need your buy-in to make that happen.
That's right. And that's one of the reasons why we did provide assistance to the Regen Farmers Network to get off the ground, because that's one of the vehicles for actually sharing that knowledge.
Given that it's 11 and we're holding you back from your morning tea, I'd like everybody to thank the Minister and Walter for starting the stimulating conversation.
Hi everyone. The irony hasn't escaped me that as I've started to talk about a drying climate in my talk, the rain has started. And so if any of you want to come and have a presentation from me at your groups anytime, I'm open to any sort of invitation. So wonderful discussion before morning tea. What I want to do now is present the climate context for this sort of change that we're talking about. Because the climate will impose a constraint, right? It's going to get tougher to execute on farming systems change. So let me take you through, and I know some of this is familiar to many of you, but I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. These are my messages, and I'll come back to them at the end of my talk and leave it up on the screen if there's time for questions. But basically it's talking about how climate change is with us, it's now locked in, it's going to keep happening. The familiar patterns of our climate are changing though, and that puts pressure on what adaptations farmers can adopt to adapt to a changing climate. There will be longer periods of drought, that's pretty certain now, and increasing periods of extreme temperatures. And while it's easy to imagine how the system might change, we'll probably be growing less grain in the eastern wheat belt and more grain in the high rainfall zone. And, there'll be some positives in the cooler, wetter parts of the state. The key issue really is how do we transition to those future states that we can all imagine. So let me get into some of the detail now. And these graphs are no doubt familiar to many of you. They're from the Bureau. They're averages for the whole South West Land Division. And we've seen this consistent drying trend in our annual rainfall in the South West since about the mid-70s, with another step change about 2000 actually, and I want to elaborate on that a little bit more. And that's been associated with about a 1 degree warming trend, what we call an anomaly versus the long-term average. About a 1 degree change associated with that drying trend in our rainfall. And you can see, by the way, in terms of what's been happening to the rainfall, the big wet years have been knocked off. And we've been getting a lot more of these dry years. Luckily, not too many of them in sequence with each other, although that's likely to change. And for those of you who are a bit nerdy about climate stuff, there's some synoptic charts for you. What's been happening is our subtropical ridge has been intensifying. That's what the greenhouse gases are doing to the energy systems around the tropics. And the subtropical ridge, which basically moves to the south of the continent in the summertime and forces the lows to pass below the continent, moves north in the wintertime and allows those fronts to pass across our agricultural zones. Now that's not happening anymore. That subtropical ridge is now hanging around lower down on the country and forcing those fronts to be hit and miss about whether they hit our farming areas during the growing season. And we're seeing some really interesting changes in our rainfall patterns at different critical times of the year. This is some work a number of us did with the growers in the Northeast Ag region back in the 06-07 drought up there, which was really quite a traumatic experience, I think, for many people. These are quite colourful diagrams, aren't they? But basically, let me take you through them. For a sand on top and for a clay loam at the bottom, this is year going across the bottom here and the dates of the autumn break period, basically from late April or mid-April through to mid-July. And the red sequence of dates are when the soil was too dry for sowing a crop. And then as the colours get colder, so they go through yellow, light blue, dark blue, the soil's getting wetter. So you can see here, particularly on the clay loam, a hell of a lot of days when we're getting our topsoils just too dry to get a crop in. At least consistently, not consistently wet enough to get a crop in and germinated, particularly from around 2000. And particularly severe on these heavier land. And I'm not telling grain growers anything new here. They know that heavy land is harder to wet up, particularly with erratic autumn breaks, and that has big consequences for getting our crops up on time. And we do know that the drying trend has been largely associated with removing excess rainfall during that winter period that really wasn't contributing much to crop growth. In fact, most of it was leaching below the root zone and into the groundwater and generating secondary salinity in many cases, and of course taking nutrients out of the system as well. So that's why, even though we've had quite a 50 to 100 mils knocked off the average Southwest Land Division annual winter rainfall, that really hasn't had much consequence in terms of yields until recently, because that rainfall really wasn't needed during that winter period. And it's really been only since about the turn of the century that we're starting to see that drying trend really starting to bite. And let me go into that a little bit more. Some work done by my colleagues recently has done a modelling exercise where we've converted the historical climate data for the Southwest Land Division into a water-limited potential wheat yield as a bioassay or as a measure of the productive potential of that season. And we've then taken those yield estimates and joined them up with what we call isolines of wheat yield, like an ISO height, if you like, for rainfall, and arbitrarily just taken the 3 tonne per hectare isoline and drawn it down through the Southwest Land Division. And around, the turn of last century, the green line was where that isoline sat. As things have dried, particularly since the year 2000, that line has moved about 40 kilometres further towards the coast. And that was reflected very much also in the first chart that the Minister showed in her talk this morning too. Now, the really interesting thing about this stuff is that most of the changes occurred since 2000. And if you look at some of the other things that have been happening since then, while we've seen wheat yields, this amazing record of productivity gains by our grain growers through the 80s and 90s, all sorts of technological adoptions occurring that result in that. Look at all the variability, though, we've seen in yield per hectare since the year 2000. So things are really starting to bite in the system now. Our crops are becoming more water limited. They're bouncing up and down in terms of their seasonal performance because water is becoming more limiting at different times of the season. And if you take the best yielding varieties from the national variety trials and plot them out too, you can see the gap between what's occurring in our plot trials and what farmers are achieving on their farms. That gap is closing. That gap is also closing when you look at it in terms of comparing another measure of potential yield, which is this line here. So these are these modelled estimates of water limited potential, around the 3 tonne per hectare average for the whole grain belt. But then we're starting to see this drop-down trend since 2000. These are the grain yields, so it includes canola and grain legumes here, by the way. Again, this fantastic productivity gain that we made, but again, this gap is closing now. A number of people have made the point today already that farmers have been incredibly successful at adapting. But I think it would be wrong for us to say that they've been adapting because it has been due to climate change. They've been adapting for sound business reasons. So even though we know a lot of grain growers now seed dry, about 50% of grain growers now seed at least 30% of their program dry, and that was almost a rare occurrence, say, 10, 15 years ago. They're doing it largely because their cropping programs are getting bigger. And they have to start earlier to get it all in on time, not because the autumn rainfall's been more erratic. That's been a sort of, if you like, a dividend for adopting that practice. Likewise, bringing in dual-purpose crops or using, say, Annamica saltbush as a summer-autumn forage to fill feed gaps at that time of year. They really haven't been doing them driven primarily by changes in rainfall patterns. They've been doing it because it makes them more money. And so I guess I'm wanting to just reinforce a couple of the comments we heard before morning tea. If we are going to look at new systems and transitioning to new systems, let's try and ride on the back of a sound business driver. And then farmers will be really willing to take it on board and explore what other benefits they can get from it, apart from improving their profitability. The sobering message is that regardless of what the world might be going to do about its emissions, we're looking at climate change being very much locked in now for the foreseeable future. These are emissions trajectories produced by the IPCC and a range of very pessimistic scenarios where the world basically doesn't do anything and keeps powering along in terms of producing CO2, versus a very optimistic scenario here, the blue one, where we actually make drastic changes to our society and decarbonise. Even if we adopt the optimistic scenario, we're still looking at about a 1 to 2 degree warming increase in the climate. Right? So that's going to be on top of the 1 degree we've seen already with all of those changes we've been talking about. So just start to imagine about the kinds of changes we're going to start seeing ahead of us if we're looking at doubling that global warming rate again. Because I think we're going to be looking at this sort of situation where historically we can sort of talk about, you know, our seasons being a third good, a third poor, and a third average, and most clever growers, farmers make most of their money in the good and sometimes in the average seasons, to a situation where maybe half of the seasons we would have normally called poor will be occurring. And you don't have to be a statistician to figure out that if poor seasons are occurring 1 out of 2, you're probably going to get quite a few that occur one after the other. Like we saw in the Northeast Ag region in the 2000s when the 06-07 drought was really quite a cataclysmic event for many broadacre farmers during that time. Now, I like to use an analogy of a colleague of mine, Peter Heyman, who works for the South Australian government, an analogy of a sandcastle at the beach when thinking about the relationship between climate change and climate variability. And let me elaborate on this because I think it's a nice analogy that we can use when communicating about this to people. Imagine you've got a sandcastle on the beach. Climate change is kind of like the tide coming in. You don't sort of notice it really unless you look at it from a long time period away. You know, you go away and you come back an hour later and gosh, yes, the tide has come in. But the climate variability is really the waves lapping on the beach. They're the things you experience immediately and the things you're conscious of when you're worried about your sandcastle getting knocked over. And of course, the chances of a wave coming in and knocking your sandcastle over are going to be greater as the tide moves in. So climate change provides that background context for why climate variability becomes more and more important to manage. That's the real challenge we have facing us with this climate change issue. And of course, the chances of getting a couple of waves in a row and knocking your sandcastle over are greater as the closer that tide moves in. I'll take the analogy just one step further, and that is it's a hell of a hard job to rebuild a sandcastle than it is to knock it over. So the kind of damage that the system experiences when it does experience a couple of hard years in a row is really quite long-lasting and very hard to recover from, relative to the very quick damage that can be done. And that's another, of course, great vulnerability of our system that we need to be thinking about building in to these new systems we're talking about. You know, there are limits to how much adaptation is going to be able to help us offset the negative impacts of climate change. This is some work done by a colleague of mine, Dean Thomas, who modelled a traditional self-replacing flock system out in the low rainfall zone and modelled a number of climate change scenarios from fairly modest through to quite severe. And you can see here, obviously, gross margin for that livestock enterprise will fall as the severity of that climate change scenario plays out. But also the degree to which adaptation can help offset that gets less and less the severer we go. So we've got to think about some new systems, I think. Not just adapting with current technology and current options in front of us now. As I said, farmers have been incredibly good at particularly doing these sorts of things down the incremental end of adaptation to adapt to a more variable climate. It's really when you start looking at some of these more challenging transformational questions we're asking, and you could argue that these are actually quite conventional compared to some of the things you were talking about before morning tea. These are still challenging things to do though, and the transitioning to them is actually the really hard part. When you do take a whole of a state view, you can have quite a bit of theoretical fun describing how you think agriculture might look in, say, 2050. This is a summary of some work that DPIRD did and Rob Submeyer. I don't know if Rob's here today, actually. who co-authored a fine report. That's if you want a really great summary of all things climate change in WA Ag, read that report that's on the DPIRD website. And I pulled Rob's work out and just summarised it. All sorts of interesting things are slated to occur in our agricultural industries by the middle of this century. Some of them I've taken a little bit of liberty with, like, I think we'll be producing most of our milk probably in indoor dairy systems because it's going to be too hot to run dairy cows. Most of our grape varieties in Margaret River will probably be warm zone varieties. They won't be cool zone ones anymore. So your SSBs, I'm sorry, they're going to be no longer available. But there'll be some positive things. We'll probably be able to grow capsicums at Manjimup. I think Perth is going to have to start growing a lot more of its veggies and fruit undercover so that it can manage climate extremes as well. So there's all sorts of things you can sort of, have a lot of fun with, but, if you're a producer or you're thinking, or you run a value chain or you're a retailer, the really hard questions are around the transitioning to those systems. So this is my little end point here is, in thinking about these new systems, we've got to think about what the business models might be. We're obviously talking about enterprises with multiple benefits associated with them, particularly natural resource management benefits. They've got to be flexible systems. Digital's got a big role to play here, I think, for monitoring automation, particularly from remote quarters, and also monitoring the system so that we can respond when the weather allows us to do something. And we'll need new plants, new animals, new water options. I know Richard's going to be talking about some of the water opportunities soon and new ways of managing our soil. So some formidable challenges here. And if I can put a little plea in for my research colleagues, a role for R&D to help you as producers evaluate those options. So thank you for listening. And if we do have a chance for any questions, Charlie, happy to take any questions.
Could you put your hands together, please, for Michael? Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. As the program indicates, Richard and I are going to do a tag team, and we're mainly going to focus on how we measure carbon emissions and then some of the tools that are available for farmers in particular to do some of that analysis. Just like to quickly capture again what the Minister presented this morning, remembering not all gases are the same, and that drives a lot of the accounting that we see, and to try and understand why some of the figures are higher or lower than you expect. So the difference between methane, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. The other thing, just to reiterate, there are three sort of key areas and ways we can measure carbon, and there are different reasons why we measure them differently. The state or national inventory, which is by sector, agriculture is that key one that we report internationally on. The second one, which we'll spend a bit more time on today, is around business or farm enterprise accounting, so a carbon account for the business, which takes into account all the inputs that are required to produce that product up to the end of the farm gate. And often you'll see Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions in the literature, and they're important because Scope 1 is all the emissions that occur on farm. Scope 2 is if you're using electricity from a different source, you have to account for the emissions that Muja is giving whilst you're using that electricity. And Scope 3, and this is a key one too, which is about capturing all the emissions from purchased inputs that it takes to produce that product. The other way of measuring our carbon emissions is through a life cycle analysis. And I won't go into that any further, but just to point out that for those of you who are livestock owners in the room, that DPIRD's just started doing a life cycle analysis for the beef industry. That's including tropical, arid and agricultural beef, so right through to the processing sector, and for the sheep industry in Western Australia as well. So we're doing some work on that broader state level analysis so we can identify hotspots in the production and processing system to be able to work on reducing those emissions or covering those emissions. So very quickly, I thought I'd just check in with a little bit of some of the values, and enteric methane was a big thumper in the agricultural emissions. And by this graph, which is the green line here is the total emissions from livestock, so that's cattle, sheep, beef, and a few goats and other extraneous animals. So as you can see over time, we're doing really well. We've reduced our methane emissions really well. But you can see the mirror image that it's really about falling stock numbers, particularly in the sheep industry, cattle industries, maintained numbers over the time. But I thought it was just worthwhile putting here on this lower green line, that's the value of that industry to the state. So efficiency is another measure when you're looking at carbon and production. Cropping, we've just heard a little bit more about cropping there, but I just thought I'd put this one up. Cropping emissions, and this is extracted from direct soil emissions, double burning, lime application, urea application, those sorts of things. So it's an amalgam. State emissions have increased a little bit over time, the trend line there, but at the same time the state yield has also increased. Small amount of increase in area cropped, but also increase in tonnage as well. And just some of the more detail about what actually the contributions, these lower ones here, the manure, which is a major livestock emission factor, but the rest is enteric methane. And cropping, direct soil emissions, indirect soil emissions, field burning, liming and urea, but the direct soil emissions is the larger one there. Now, I'd just like to spend a little bit of time, a few minutes, that at Katanning Research Facility last year, we decided to undertake a full carbon account of the business. We run a farm of about 7,000 sheep, crop about 400 hectares, did a full carbon account so we could understand what the hotspots were. So things like electricity, for example, at 1%, it wasn't a big user, it wasn't a big contribution. A lot of people think it's a lot more than that. Diesel the same at 3%. So it was very useful to understand those. And we've got about 2,500 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year come off that farm. We're going through the process now. We've identified a whole range of management practices, flock structure changes, efficiency changes that we can reduce carbon emissions on the farm. It's complex. They interact with each other. It's hard to get that detail, and that's some of the things that, as researchers and with people to really concentrate on this, recognise that some of those issues that everybody's going to face, trying to come to grips with how they really measure their carbon and what then can they do about it to become carbon neutral. So carbon neutral is our goal in 2030 on the Katanning Research Facility, reducing both the state government emissions from an asset, but also using it as an opportunity to really understand what it takes, what are the gaps, how we can help you, what sort of information we've got. I'm going to hand over to Richard now, so he's going to talk a little bit more about the tools.
All right, thanks, Mandy. I was tasked to look at the carbon calculators that were available to producers to work out your baseline emissions and around the world. And I was really interested in more what was freely available to farmers and that wasn't behind a paywall for you. So there was a couple of references, level of detail of inputs, the appropriateness of the language and the inputs, that sort of thing, and the strengths and weaknesses of each tools. So I came up with, well, there was 4 primary ones: the University of Melbourne Primary Industries Climate Challenges Centre, and that is a Excel-based spreadsheet There's the Cool Farm tool internationally around the world. That is an online tool with international emissions behind it. There's the AFI online tool that is available online, but that hasn't been updated for 5 years, so there's some challenges there. And then I was keen to look at one out of Scotland, AgriCalc, and the differences there. FarmPrint is behind a paywall at the moment, or being developed, but is grains only. There's no livestock part of that, so was excluded from this sort of comparison. And then the Look-See tool as well, which was more about how much a project will contribute to your emissions rather than actually baseline emissions itself. And there are other proprietary calculators that are available. The data that I used, it was the same farm data all the way through, a live client of mine based in Wandering, and the same baseline data was put into the calculators. So 50-50 crop sheep. Last year we had about 450 mils of rain. The 5-year average is 550. The average temperature, which is important in the Cool Farm Tools calculator, was 16 degrees on average. And the Cool Farm Tools was interesting. I could choose between 10 degrees as being temperate or 18 degrees being tropical. And that was a bit of a challenge. Soils, predominantly forest gravel soils. We grow barley, oats and canola, and we've got about 15,000 head of stock at any one time. Blue was the University of Melbourne calculator. The red orangey colour is AFI, and the Cool Farm Tools is in grey, and AgriCalc is in yellow, and the average green. So as you can see, there were some big variations between the calculators. We averaged about 1,800 kilos for the crop, from a low of about 600 up to about 3,000. And yeah, we averaged about, was that 5,000 on the sheep, with a high of 5.5 down to about 1,800. What I was more interested in, the totals for the farms, was between 2,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, and Mandy's on the Katanning Research Station was 2.5, up to about 8,500. So big range there. I personally, with my clients, I use the PICCC GAF calculator. We're looking at 4,725 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, and if we had to go and buy offsets for that, at $18 a tonne would cost the farm $83,000. So reduction is important. I was more interested in the variation from average. How accurate were the tools? And when I was looking at the difference from the average, the University of Melbourne tool, the PICCC, and the Cool Farm tools came within 10% of the average, giving me a little bit of confidence around the accuracy and suitability for the farms that I'm looking at. AgriCalc was up to 60% difference, and that doesn't surprise me. It's a Scottish-based calculator with Scottish calculations. So we're going to be struggling with that. And the AFI one as well, with some big differences there. Again, hasn't been updated for a while, so some challenges there. So really, the message is for me, the accuracy of the results generated is highly dependent on the quality of the data going in. Rubbish in, rubbish out. And the amount of detail and the level of information required by the calculators, the Cool Farm Tools calculator was quite specific. The University of Melbourne calculator was a lot more simple and didn't require as much thinking from the farmer's point of view in terms of stock movement, that sort of thing. Each calculator covers emissions, only some covers sequestration. So Cool Farm Tools covers soil carbon sequestration. I omitted that from the comparison because obviously not all of them had that, so it would be unfair to account for sequestration. And the interpretation of the results and application in the refining of the management strategies outside of methodologies, I think, is more important because it's not well understood. We can baseline the data, but understanding the implications and practical applications on farm is much more important. And really, my final message is, if you're looking at baselining your own place in carbon baseline, is to pick a calculator and stick with it for a number of years. This is an emerging space. They're being refined all the time. And one calculator, not all calculators are going to be 100% accurate. No, one calculator is. and they're being developed as the science develops as well. So for me, it's more, let's start learning and understanding where we're at, and we can start to make some changes there and build the knowledge.
Thanks.
This is a bit of a tactical talk about drought and water, so give you context, and you can read the words. So when they interviewed farmers coming out of the millennium drought over east, there were three things that really stood out: feed, cover, and water. So that was what really drove the emotional response and the how do you farm in a drought landscape. So I'm going to focus on water, and I'm not so much talking about climate variability on top of natural variability or which one comes first. The practicality of when you've had 2 or 3 really dry years in a row, which is essentially what we just came out of. And in fact, we actually did the same thing in 68, 69 and 70, so it's not like it was the first time. We ended up with the really obscure outcomes where we had farmers, we were carting 450 road trains, a week going out to supply, otherwise stable and good and conventional farming business. So something's gone wrong. And Michael's given you some perspective about some of those big picture conditional changes. But in the wheat belt water story, it wasn't just that that bloke standing on a dam that was going to go dry every year. It was actually the fact that some of our best dams and our best roaded catchments, which are old technology, relied and proven for many, many years, failed us. So we had livestock, we couldn't meet their daily demands. And so we started to have to relook at what was actually something that we needed to plan for in the future. So that's a perspective about the risk. This is a perspective about the opportunity. So this is 3 plots. One is the response. In the wheat belt, we're doing the exception to climate change. We're actually growing our water resource. Perversely, we're growing our water resource as a result of clearing and something to do with agronomy. And these 2 plots here are just the rate at which the water tables are filling in the wheat belt. And there isn't a climate signal in that. I was hoping 2010 and 2000, we'd actually see the water tables start to drop off. They haven't done that. And this is not everywhere in the wheat belt. This is Wickerpen, this is Dumbliung, this is Coolin, and every red triangle there is this story. So perversely, we actually have an opportunity to capitalise on a whole lot of water that sits under the wheat belt. So against this climate story, we've actually got a water resource story. So Water Smart Farms, which I'll get to in one more slide, is farmers in the last 2 or 3 years have started to experiment with an innovative technology called RO desalination. When was the first RO plant put out in the wheat belt? Anyone got an idea? John Loney, I want you to answer this. 1983. Righto? It's a long time ago that the first RO plant went out in the wheat belt, but nobody's adopted. In the last 2 to 3 years, we've had 40 or 50 farmers take on RO desalination as their fail-safe resource, a supply for the wheat belt, and Water Smart Farms is a way of trying to understand whether that's a great technology, an okay technology, and how we apply it. So the Minister, about 18 months ago, said, what do we do about drought? And so I said, well, let's have a go back to RO desalination, capitalise on this massive water resource opportunity. We've got a rising water table. We've got a lot of water. I mean, it's a megalitre per hectare for every 1 metre rise. It's lots. So what are we doing? We are putting about $200,000 into going to talk to these 50 adopters, find out why they did it, how it's gone, and learn the learning. 101 extension technology, ask the farmer, did it work? Is it working? Why isn't it working? So not rocket science. The second part of the problem is how do we get the water out of the ground at enough locations and enough of it in a secure enough way so that you can not only potentially run this at a farm business level, but potentially we can actually do it at a community level. And we're spending about $600,000 looking at RO technologies about which ones give us the best opportunity. And there's some gaps around dams, which is where I was coming from, but there's quite a few investors in this space, and the Drought Fund is in this space. The red arrows over here is kind of where we're focusing, and there's a lot of boxes that are not ticked. Enough said. Okay, so key messages from what I've just said. Whether it's natural variability forced by climate change, whatever the driving factors are, we know when it gets dry, it's getting drier for longer. And we saw in the last couple of years that our farming systems couldn't cope with 2 or 3 decile threes. You know, that really struggled. Our conventional system struggled. The demand is not only changing for quantity, it's changing for quality. If you want good productive agronomy systems, whether it's herbicide or whatever, you've got to have quality water. And our fit for purpose water for farms for animals has got to get better than what it's been, because quite often it's not great water. I think we've got some big picture stories. We're actually carting, in the growing world of desalination, we're carting water from the coast out of a desal plant up a 300 metre hill, 300 kilometres into the wheat belt, running over the top of all this brackish water. You know, really? Can we do better than that? So Water Smart Farms is the start of, it's not the end of, how do we use a resource that's in abundance in the wheat belt, using a technology that's actually quite old and can be made a lot better, to deal with, there's going to be some rejected water, we've got to learn how to deal with that, and to run that sort of adoption demonstration and exploration project, and that's a $1.5 million investment. It started a few months ago. It runs up to about June in 2023. And we've got 200,000 dams out there, which are old technology. It's $1 billion worth of sunk investment. They could do a lot better with surface water. Why are we doing this? Because as it gets drier, as we need better on-farm resilience, we need to go back to our old technology. We need to look at new technology. That's what Water Smart Farms is. And that's a climate adoption and a resilience project. And it started, and we're in the middle of it, or early days of it. Thank you.
Thanks. First, thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm fairly new to Western Australia. I've been here for about 18 months, so I'm still getting to know you. I think I got here just in time as well, because of the problems in the West. So I was going to talk to you about soil carbon, and I was going to talk to you about measurement of soil carbon and some really cool science and the measurement of the technologies and the modelling. But actually, last night I grounded myself a little bit and I changed my talk. And I'm going to talk to you about soil carbon sequestration. Okay, so let me get going. So as you all know, over the last decade or so, soil carbon has gathered a lot of attention. And the reason is that it holds a lot of carbon. Soil holds more carbon than vegetation and the atmosphere all combined, okay? And the concerns over the stability of that carbon has really catapulted soils into the scientific and political agenda. Now the significance of soil carbon for mitigating climate change has been highlighted by this 4 per mil initiative, which the Minister alluded to earlier. This was proposed by the French Minister of Agriculture in 2015 at COP21. So the idea here is that if one makes a very small increase in carbon of the global carbon stocks, then you can, let me see if this works, okay. You can then compensate for the emissions of fossil fuels every year. So the calculation goes, if you do a 0.4% times the 2,500 gigatons of carbon, then you get about 10 gigatons, which compensates for that value there. So this is a little bit of a back of the envelope type calculation, right? And it's quite debatable whether this is actually achievable and at the scale at which we need it to be achievable. But the people that proposed it call it an aspirational target. And I tend to agree, I think. It's similar to campaigns like, for instance, eat your 5 veggies, 5 fruits a day. Not everybody can do that, but it's not a bad thing to try. And that's how I think that's what I think of the 4 per mil. So what is soil organic carbon? What's soil organic matter? So organic matter is everything that's lived or is living in the soil. It comes from the decomposition of plant and animal residues by microbes. About half of the organic matter is made up of carbon. The other half is other nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and the like. The decomposition of organic matter produces minerals needed for that plants need, but it also releases greenhouse gases. Now, this is one of my favorite diagrams, and I could spend the whole 10 minutes of my talk talking about it, but I won't. I just want to make 3 points. Organic matter is a really complex mixture of molecules and compounds which are at various stages of decomposition. So from debris to small pieces of plant material to the remnants of dead microbes, the byproducts, exudates, to stuff that's minerally linked. So the second point is that it's these molecules that enable the soil functions, climate change mitigation, food production, and so on. And the final point is that if you want to increase soil carbon, then you need to manage the balance between what you're putting in and what's being lost. And you need to do this locally. You need to consider local soil, local environmental conditions, and local management. Okay, so if we look a little bit more closely at the composition of soil organic carbon, that complexity can be simplified by separating the different types of carbon, by fractionating the carbon or separating it into some different components. And these components are separated based on their physical-chemical characteristics and the turnover time, okay? So we have here the particulate organic carbon, which is made up of larger pieces of decaying organic matter, which tend to cycle faster. So I like to think of the particulate carbon as the junk food for microbes, right? It's really accessible. It's possibly quite tasty, but it's not very nutritious. You have the mineral-associated carbon, which is made up of smaller, mostly microbially derived molecules. It cycles much slower, and it tends to persist for longer periods in the soil. And then you have this pyrogenic carbon, which is mostly from fires. It's fairly inert, and it can remain in the soil for centuries or even millennia. So these different types of carbon define the soil functions, as I said. So for instance, if you're interested in climate change mitigation, I guess you sort of focus on this mineral-associated fraction. If you are interested in soil health, biodiversity, perhaps you want this faster cycling carbon in your soil. So I'm not saying that you just need to focus on any one particular type of carbon, but if you, it's important to consider that these different types of carbon are in your soil because potentially they also need to be managed somewhat differently. So a little bit about what stabilizes carbon in the soil. So several processes help to stabilize carbon in the soil, and this is just a very quick summary of those processes. So stabilization can occur through the complexation and adsorption of organic molecules with clay minerals and oxides. And so obviously then soil type, texture, mineralogy becomes quite important in this case. It can also, stabilization can also occur through physical protection of the organic molecules by minerals. So this is controlled by the microhabitat conditions, so where the microbes live. And so it's dependent on things like climate, water availability, management, tillage, for example. And then you have these recalcitrants, chemical recalcitrants, which only really applies to the pyrogenic carbon because recent studies have shown that almost everything else in soil can be decomposed by microbes. One of the points that I want to make here is that, well, these processes are rather complex and there's quite a lot of research. It's a really active area of research. But the point is that persistence is really an ecosystem property, rather than any one of these processes occurring at any one time. Now on to carbon sequestration and what's the potential for carbon sequestration in Australian soils. Well, to tell you the truth, there isn't much data out there. We really don't know. What we do know is that we've lost quite a lot of carbon through the conversion of native ecosystems to agriculture. And a meta-analysis that was performed, well, a decade ago, and it's still fairly relevant, showed that we've lost 40 to 80% of carbon from pre-clearing levels. So obviously, we think that this provides an opportunity to recover that carbon. Now we're doing some modelling in Curtin that is starting to give us some insights into what these values might be, but I'll tell you about those some other time, I think. I want to make some points about soil carbon sequestration, and I'm going to use this sort of animation diagram to do that. So on the X we have time, on the Y we have the soil carbon stocks, and let's say that this curve you had some native ecosystem with its carbon stocks at equilibrium, and then you did something, you changed land use and you lost carbon, and that carbon reached a new equilibrium. So, okay, now let's say that at time 0 here, you introduce some management to try and recapture that carbon lost. If you do this for years, right, soil carbon will increase and then it will reach a plateau. But there are 3 points that I want to make. So soil carbon change is slow. It will take years, decades, potentially, to happen, right? So this has both management and policy implications, of course. The second point is that carbon sequestration is not linear, right? It will saturate. It will reach an upper level. It doesn't matter if you implement your activity using the best of bestest practices, right? It will reach an equilibrium. And the third point that I want to make is that measurement, monitoring and verification are absolutely crucial. And I put this down here in red because in Australia, we have world-leading technologies that can help us to do this measurement and monitoring. And some of these methods are currently part of the Emission Reduction Fund legislation. Okay, so the amount of carbon depends on management, right? Here, if you implement this management B, you will get more carbon. It will give you a larger stock. And I list down here some of the potentially good activities that can help you do that. But I think that this is also where we can innovate. And I'm sure a lot of you guys are doing that right now. But regardless, there will be an upper limit, like I said. And this upper limit might not necessarily be for that particular carbon or even that total carbon, but certainly for that stable type of carbon, the mineral-associated carbon. And that's important to note. Yeah, there's a bit of research to do that here as well, I think. The next point in my little animation is that carbon storage is reversible. If you stop your practice, you fairly quickly will lose the carbon and it will go back to that previous equilibrium. If you do nothing, then severe loss can occur and you'll degrade your soil. Now, one of the things that my little cartoon didn't account for, so there are other constraints, of course, right? There are some, for instance, some biophysical constraints. So, you know, to grow plants, you need water, you need nutrients, and in some of our environments in Australia, those are limiting. So you need to consider that. But of course, like Walter said, there's innovation, and you can do things to overcome those issues. Okay, not much to go now because I think I'm going to make Charlie and Karine very unhappy if I talk too much. Just wanted to show you some data. Australia has this national baseline map of soil carbon. It's actually used to inform the greenhouse gas inventory. We are developing a new one at Curtin, actually, that will also include marine and coastal biomes. But what this map tells us is that we have about 30 tonnes per hectare average in Australian soils, and the total stock is about 25 gigatons, which is a little low compared to other places in the world, and it's about 3.5% of the global stocks. But what I want to show you here, if you look at the semi-arid and the arid environments, which roughly are represented by these red and yellow areas on this little map here, and I've highlighted the bits of the graph that I want you to look at. You can see that this
dry areas don't have a lot of carbon, so the mean carbon stock is quite low. But because of the vast areas that they occupy, the total stock is quite large. So in fact, the rangelands hold about, or perhaps even more than half of the total stock of carbon in Australia. So it's similar for Western Australia, for instance. The mean stock is the third lowest of the country. It's about 26 tonnes per hectare. But Western Australia holds the largest total stock of any of the other states. And so the relevance lies in that even small increases in the soil organic carbon stocks across vast areas of land can make a significant difference to mitigation. Okay, some more things. So now if you look at the composition of soil organic carbon, so we also have maps of the composition of carbon, and these maps are at a fairly fine spatial resolution. So you have maps of the particulate, the mineral associated, and the pyrogenic. And this sort of colourful map in the middle is just an overlay of those, so that because it's compositional, you can sort of get an idea of where these different types of carbon occur. So the reds are the particulate, those fast cycling carbon. The blues are the mineral associated, the more stable ones, and the greens are those ones that are produced by fire. And so if we use this data, we can derive an index of vulnerability to decomposition, which is simply just a ratio of the faster cycling over the slower cycling fractions. So briefly, what this data shows is that temperate areas with mostly the particulate carbon are potentially more vulnerable to carbon loss. So for climate change mitigation, management in these areas might aim to preserve that carbon. But importantly also what these maps show is that we should aim to better understand and investigate the potential for carbon capture in areas of land which have the smaller carbon stocks but are potentially more stable. So these blue purplish areas. Second last slide, I wanted to say something about measurement. There are a couple of ERF methods currently that people can use to measure and monitor soil carbon. One's based on measurements, one's based on modelling. The measurement-based method is a world-leading method. It uses modern technology, sensing to lower the cost of analysis. The Clean Energy Regulator is currently working on an update to these methods. And the new method will be a hybrid method, which will enable people to use both measurement and modelling in a single project. So we have all these methods. They're scientifically robust, cool, everything. But what we actually need, we need to develop robust practical systems for their implementation, because these methods are not easy. So the science is there, the methods are there. We need to develop the tools to help implement and to enable uptake of those methods. So final remarks very quickly. Soil carbon has multiple benefits. It's not just about climate change mitigation. It's not just about economics. Assessments of potential seed capture need to be done locally. That's really important. Although we have the methods for measuring, there's a really urgent need for developing practical tools to enable farmers and practitioners to actually use those. Science innovation supported by government initiatives is absolutely essential, so this is really, really, really great. And my final comment is soil carbon is not a silver bullet for climate change mitigation. It should be part of the solution, really. So with that, thanks.